The alien princess was confronting death when a human warrior arrived. Part 1. The planet of Valindra was one of the most beautiful places in the known galaxy. Its sky was a deep shade of blue that shifted to violet near the horizon every evening. Its forests glowed at night, soft and warm, like thousands of small candles placed between the trees. The cities were built from living coral and pale stone, and the rivers ran so clear that you could see the silver fish swimming at the bottom, even from a bridge 10 meters above. It was a world that had not seen war in over 400 years. The people of Valindra had grown up without the sound of weapons or the smell of burning buildings. They were tall and silver-skinned, with large dark eyes and long fingers that were made for art and writing and music, not fighting. And they called themselves the Valindrans, and they were proud of the peace they had built. Princess Liara Velsorin had grown up inside that peace. She was 19 cycles old, which made her roughly the same age as a human woman in her mid-20s. She was lean and sharp-faced, with silver hair that she kept pulled back when she was studying and let fall loose when she was walking the palace gardens. She was not a soft person. Her tutors said she had a mind like a blade, fast, precise, and sometimes a little dangerous. She had studied diplomacy, history, science, and the political structures of a dozen different civilizations. She could read 3 languages and speak 5. She knew how wars started and how treaties were written. She knew almost everything a future queen would need to know. She did not know how to run for her life, and she had never needed to. That changed on a morning that began like any other. Liara was in the palace library when the alarms started. They were soft alarms at first, the kind that rang when a ship entered Valindran space without clearance. She did not panic. Ships took wrong turns. Traders sometimes drifted too close. She set down her book and waited for the sound to stop. It did not stop. She walked to the window. The sky above the capital city was still blue. Then it was not. Something moved across the upper atmosphere, something enormous and dark, like a shadow thrown by a moon. But it was not a moon. It was a fleet. She could see the shapes now, long and angular, moving in tight formation, dropping lower with every second. There were dozens of them, maybe more. The alarms changed. They became loud and sharp and urgent. In a sound Liara had only ever heard in history lessons. Her father's guard captain, an older Valindran named Orvael, came running into the library with his robe still half-tied. He grabbed her arm without ceremony and pulled her toward the back corridor. He told her the fleet was Crethon. He said it quickly, the way people say things they wish were not true. Liara had read about the Crethon. Everyone had. They were enormous creatures, insectoid and armored, built like war machines from birth. They did not negotiate. They did not occupy worlds for politics or resources alone. They came because they could. They came because destruction was, for them, a form of satisfaction. Every civilization that had stood in their path had either been consumed or scattered across the stars like dust. Valindra had no army. See, it had a small peacekeeping force, a few patrol ships, and ceremonial guards who carried weapons they had barely used in years. It had philosophers and artists and scientists. It had 400 years of peace. It was not enough. The first explosion hit the eastern quarter of the capital before Orvael got Liara to the lower passage. The whole palace shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Liara grabbed the wall and kept her footing. She did not scream. She pressed her lips together and moved faster. Her father, King Selvorn Velsorin, was in the throne room. He had refused to leave. Orvael had told him, and he had shaken his head and said that a king does not run from his own hall. 3 of his personal guards stayed with him. Liara had wanted to go back. Orvael would not let her. She never saw her father again. When the passage led beneath the palace, through old stone tunnels that smelled of cold earth and aged wood. Orvael had 2 other guards with him, young ones, both armed with standard-issue energy pistols. He also had Liara's handmaiden, a quiet girl named Sela, who had been waiting at the passage entrance with a travel bag already packed. Sela was 17 cycles old. She was shaking, but she kept moving. They came out of the tunnel on the far side of the city near the old university district. The sky above the palace was on fire. The sound of it reached them a second later, a long, rolling boom that Liara felt in her chest. She stopped for just a moment and looked back. The towers of the royal palace were gone. There was smoke where the spires had been. She turned away and kept walking. They moved for hours through the city. He's staying low, staying quiet. Orvael knew the streets well. He took them through back alleys and closed markets and empty schoolyards. The city was chaos. People were running in every direction. Some were trying to help others. Some were simply trying to survive. Crethon ground units had already landed in the northern sectors. You could hear them before you saw them, a heavy clicking sound like armored joints and a low mechanical hum from their weapons. By the time evening came, Orvael was dead. One of the young guards was dead too. The other had taken a burn to his leg and could barely walk. Sela had a deep cut across her side from falling through a broken window during a close call near the river road. She was pale and breathing too fast. Liara had torn a strip from her own clothes and pressed it hard against the wound. And the way she had read about in a field medicine chapter of an old military history book. It slowed the bleeding. It was not enough, but it was something. They found shelter in the shell of a collapsed tower near the Eastern University. The top floors had caved in, but the lower rooms were still standing, protected by thick old walls. Liara helped the wounded guard sit down. She checked Sela's bandage again. Then she looked around at what she had. One guard, one handmaiden. No weapons of her own, no communication with the palace, no plan. She was the last member of the royal bloodline. She knew this not because anyone had told her, but because she had watched the palace burn and understood what that meant. She sat down on a broken piece of stone and thought, very carefully and very quickly. She remembered a lesson from 2 years ago, and a diplomat's class on emergency interstellar communication. Her teacher had listed the old registered frequencies, the ones that different civilizations had opened for emergency use in the early years of galactic contact. One of them belonged to the Terran Federation. Humans. Young, strange, and known for showing up in unexpected places. Liara did not know much about humans. Most scholars considered them an interesting but minor civilization, too young to be truly significant. They had no special abilities, no ancient wisdom, no grand fleet, but they had registered a frequency, and they had kept it open. She found the emergency transmitter in Orvael's travel pack, small and battered, with a cracked casing. She checked the battery. It was low. She had maybe one transmission in it, maybe two. She set the frequency. She composed the signal in Standard Galactic. She kept it short because short was all she had power for. She gave her name, her world, and her location. She said she was alive. She said others were alive. She said help was needed. Then she pressed send. The transmitter went dark. She set it down on the stone floor and looked at the wounded guard, who had fallen asleep from blood loss and exhaustion. She looked at Sela, who was watching her with large, frightened eyes. Liara did not tell Sela that no one would probably come. She did not say that the transmission might not reach anyone, or that even if it did, there was no reason for a stranger to risk their life for a dying world they had never visited. She said nothing at all. She sat with her back against the cold wall and listened to the sounds of her city burning, and she waited. And outside, the Crethon patrols moved through the streets below, clicking and humming in the dark. Inside the broken tower, a princess sat in the rubble of everything she had known and refused, very quietly, to stop hoping. The alien princess was confronting death when a human warrior arrived. Part 2. The signal came in at 0340 hours, ship time. Sergeant Cole Danner was awake when it arrived. He was almost always awake at odd hours. It was a habit he had picked up during his first deployment years ago, when sleeping through the night felt like a luxury that the universe was not in the habit of offering. He was sitting in the small rear section of the Gray Heron with a cup of cooling coffee and a field manual he had already read 3 times. The ship was quiet. The stars outside the porthole were steady and still. When the alert chimed from the communication panel, he set down his cup and walked to the front of the ship. Cole Danner was 31 years old and had grown up on a cattle ranch in rural Montana, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was 40 minutes away by truck, and the winters lasted half the year. He was not a large man by soldier standards, but he was built solidly, with wide shoulders and hands that were rough from years of work. He had a plain face, the kind that people forgot easily, with pale eyes that did not give much away. His voice was low and even, and he used it sparingly. His unit commander had once written in an evaluation that Danner was the most difficult man to rattle he had ever met. Cole had read the evaluation, shrugged, and gone back to cleaning his rifle. He looked at the signal on the screen, but it was faint. The source transmitter had clearly been running on almost no power. The message was in Standard Galactic, which the ship's system translated instantly. A name, a world, a location. 3 sentences saying that people were alive and that help was needed. Cole read it twice. Lieutenant Danny Farrow was asleep in the bunk behind the cockpit. Cole tapped the wall twice, their agreed signal for wake-up, and waited. Danny appeared a minute later, rubbing his eyes, hair going in 3 directions. He was 26, from Houston, and he had a face that always looked like it was about to say something confident. He was a good pilot and a decent soldier, and he talked considerably more than Cole did, which was not difficult. Danny looked at the screen. He looked at Cole. He said, "That's not our sector." "No," Cole agreed. That's actually pretty far from our sector." "Yes." Danny pulled up the star charts. He found Valindra easily. He then pulled up the current intelligence reports on Crethon fleet movements, which Cole had already read the previous evening. The reports were 3 days old, but they were clear enough. The Crethon had been pushing in that direction for weeks. Nobody had expected them to move that fast. "We should report it up the chain," Danny said. "Get a proper fleet response organized. That's the protocol." Cole was already opening the navigation panel. Danny watched him for a moment. Then he sighed the sigh of a man who already knew how this was going to go, and he sat down in the pilot's seat. "How far?" he asked. 6 hours at full burn," Cole said. "And if there's a Crethon fleet sitting in orbit when we get there?" "The Gray Heron is small and it has a good cloaking system," Cole said. "We go in quiet. And if there's a Crethon ground unit between us and whoever sent that signal." Cole said nothing. He just looked at Danny. Danny turned back to the controls and punched in the course. "For the record," he said, "I am logging this officially as an unsanctioned humanitarian deviation." "Noted," Cole said, "and I want that in writing. I'll write it down later." The Gray Heron turned and burned hard toward Valindra. They came out of the jump 6 hours later, and Danny pulled the cloaking system on immediately. What they saw in orbit was bad. 14 Crethon warships, large ones, sitting in low orbit above the planet like a wall. The transport vessels were moving up and down between them, carrying equipment and likely materials stripped from the surface. Cole watched the sensor readouts without expression. Danny said very quietly, "Okay." Cole put on his armor. It was standard Terran Federation combat gear, the kind built for a single soldier operating without backup in hostile environments. It was lighter than it looked, built from layered composite materials that could stop most energy weapon hits at range. It had a small, integrated sensor system in the helmet that let him track movement nearby. He checked his pulse rifle, checked both sidearms, checked the blade at his hip, and then picked up his med kit and secured it to his left thigh. Danny watched all of this. "You know there could be hundreds of Crethon down there?" "Yes," Cole said. "No, and you're going alone." You need to stay with the ship, Cole said. I'll need it in one piece for extraction. Danny opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, Feed your locator signal through the helmet relay. I'll track you the whole time. Cole nodded. He pulled his helmet on. Danny brought the gray heron down through the atmosphere on a slow, careful trajectory, hugging the shadow of a mountain range on the western side of the planet. The cloaking held. Nobody shot at them. He put the ship down in a dry riverbed 4 kilometers from the signal's origin point and kept the engine idling. Cole stepped out into the air of a burning world. The smell hit him first. Smoke and something sharp, chemical, the kind of burning that came from energy weapons cooking through stone and metal. The sky to the north was orange, and he could hear, distantly, the mechanical clicking of Crethon patrol units. He oriented himself using the helmet's navigation, took the most sheltered route through the broken outskirts of the city, and moved at a pace that was quick but not reckless. He saw 3 Crethon units along the way. He avoided all of them. The tower was not hard to find. It was one of the few structures in that area still partially standing. Cole approached from the eastern side, found a collapsed section of the upper wall, and dropped through it into the lower room below. He landed quietly and straightened up. The first thing he saw was a silver-skinned girl raising a broken metal pipe at him. He looked at the pipe. It was a good instinct, he noted. Most people in her situation would have frozen or hidden. She had picked up a weapon instead. That he gave her credit for that. He looked at her more carefully. Young, dressed in clothes that had once been fine but were now torn and dusty. Silver hair, loose around her face. Large, dark eyes that were scared but were trying very hard not to show it. Behind her, a younger girl was lying against the wall, pale and clearly hurt. A male Valindran sat nearby, barely conscious. Cole held both hands out to his sides, away from his weapons. He said in standard Galactic, I'm not here to hurt you. Is that your wounded friend? He did not wait for permission. He crossed the room, knelt beside the injured girl, and opened his medkit. Liara did not lower the pipe. She watched him move, watched his hands, watched his face. He did not look at her again. He focused entirely on Sela. We're running a small scanner over the wound and reading the results with the focus of someone who had done this many times before. His movements were quick and clean. He took out a field seal applicator, cleaned the wound with a spray that made Sela hiss, and closed it with 3 precise applications of the tool. 12 minutes. That was all it took. When he was done, Sela's breathing had steadied, and the gray look was leaving her face. He stood up and looked at Liara again. She was still holding the pipe. You can put that down if you want, he said. He did not say it like a command. He said it like a suggestion, the way you might suggest someone sit down after a long walk. She lowered it slowly. We need to move, he said. I counted a patrol of 14 on the South Road. There will be more before long. You are one soldier, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He did not seem concerned by the math. My name is Cole, he said. What do I call you? She straightened her back without thinking about it. I am Liara Velsorin, she said. Princess of Valindra. Cole nodded, as though this were ordinary information. All right, he said. He looked at the wounded guard. He looked at Sela, who was sitting up now, eyes clearer. He looked back at the door. Can she walk? He asked, nodding at Sela. I think so, Liara said. Then let's go, Cole said. He moved to the door, checked the gap, listened for 10 full seconds, and then stepped out into the ruins of the city. Liara helped Sela to her feet. She left the pipe on the ground. And then she followed the human soldier out into the dark because she had sent a signal into the void, and against every reasonable expectation, something had answered. The alien princess was confronting death when a human warrior arrived. Part 3. Cole moved like he had done this 100 times before because he had. He stayed close to the walls, chose narrow streets over open squares, and paused at every corner before crossing. Liara and Sela followed behind him, staying in the shadow he walked through. The wounded guard, whose name was Peelin, was too weak to move quickly. Cole had given him a basic pain blocker from the med kit, which had helped enough that the man could limp forward at a slow pace. Cole adjusted his speed without comment. Liara watched the human as they moved. She had studied humans in her diplomatic education, and the academic texts described them as a young civilization, only a few centuries into space travel, with no remarkable biological traits, no telepathy, no natural armor, shorter and lighter than most of the elder species. They had a reputation for being loud and emotional, for making decisions based on feeling rather than reason. Several of the scholars she had read called them charming but ultimately unreliable at a galactic scale. Cole was the quietest person she had ever been near. He did not speak unless it was necessary. When he did speak, it was in short, clear sentences. He used no wasted words. He checked every doorway before stepping through it. He scanned the rooftops without being obvious about it. His hand rested near his rifle, but never gripped it unless something changed. He was not tense. He was simply ready, which was a different thing, and Liara was starting to understand the difference. Danny's voice came through Cole's earpiece every few minutes with sensor updates. Cole listened, gave a one-word response, and adjusted their route. He had routed them around 2 patrols already, and Liara had not even seen either one. She had only heard the clicking, far off, fading as they turned away from it. They were 3 streets from the old university district when the 3rd patrol found them anyway. Cole stopped. He put one hand up and flat, the universal signal for halt. Liara stopped immediately. Sela pressed against the wall beside her. Palin leaned on a broken door frame and held his breath. 14 Crethon warriors came around the far corner. Liara had seen Crethon from a distance, from the palace window, when they were still shapes in the sky or figures far across the burning city. Up close, they were something else entirely. They were 2.5 meters tall, each one built like a moving fortress. Their shells were black and ridged, segmented across the joints, and they moved with a heavy, deliberate weight that made the ground vibrate slightly beneath their feet. Their weapon arms were raised and active. Their optical sensors swept the street in a regular pattern. There were 14 of them. Liara counted quickly, the way her tutors had trained her. 14, in a tight patrol formation, weapons live. She felt something cold move through her. Not panic. She was past panic. But a clear, sharp understanding that they were going to die here. Cole stepped forward. But he walked out of the shadow of the building and into the middle of the street, and for one strange second, Liara thought he had lost his mind. Then his rifle came up and he fired twice, very fast, and the 2 lead Crethon dropped before the others had processed what was happening. The remaining 12 reacted immediately. They were trained soldiers, and they were fast. 3 of them opened fire on Cole's position. Cole was not there anymore. He had already moved to the left, behind a collapsed wall section, and was firing again from a lower angle while the energy blasts from the Crethon weapons tore into the space he had just left. Liara pulled Sela flat against the wall behind a thick pillar. She could not look away. Cole worked the terrain like it was a tool. The street was narrow enough that the Crethon could not all advance at once. But the rubble and collapsed sections gave him cover that their size made harder to use. He moved constantly, never staying still long enough to be a clear target, always angling toward the narrow side passages and tight corners where their bulk was a disadvantage. He fired in short bursts, controlled and deliberate, never wasting energy. One Crethon broke from the group and charged. It was fast for something that large. It closed the gap in seconds and swung at Cole with an armored arm that would have crushed stone. Cole dropped low, moved under the swing, and drove something into the joint at the back of the creature's knee with precise force. The Crethon staggered. Cole moved behind it and fired once from the base of the neck, where the shell plating separated. The creature went down. He took a hit. It was a glancing shot from one of the rear-line Crethon, catching him across the left shoulder. Liara saw the flash and saw Cole stumble half a step. She felt her throat tighten. Then he caught his balance, pressed behind a corner, and kept going. He did not slow down. He did not stop. 3 more Crethon were down by the time he circled back to the east side of the street. The remaining group tried to push through a wider gap in the rubble to surround him, but Cole had already anticipated it. He pulled 2 small devices from his belt and placed them at the gap entrance without looking, triggered them, and moved back behind cover. The devices were not explosive. They released a burst of focused electromagnetic interference. Crethon weapons and sensor systems ran on a specific frequency. Cole knew this. Their weapons seized up for 11 seconds. 11 seconds was more than enough. When the last Crethon dropped, the street was quiet. Cole stood in the settling dust and reached up with his right hand to press a small cloth from his kit against the burn on his shoulder. He stood there for a moment, breathing steadily. He ran a quick check over his rifle, checked the power cell, checked the 2 sidearms at his sides. He looked back at Liara. "Ready to move?" he asked. His voice was the same as it had been before the fight. Even, unhurried. Liara realized she was gripping the pillar with both hands. She let go. She had read stories about warriors. Every civilization had them, legends of great fighters, heroes celebrated in history and myth. The Valindrans had their own ancient warrior figures. I remembered from the era before the Long Peace, depicted in paintings with golden light around them and expressions of fierce nobility. They were grand figures. They were symbols. Cole was not a symbol. He was a man standing in a broken street with a burn on his shoulder, checking his rifle the way a carpenter checks his tools after a long day of work. There was no golden light. There was no fierce nobility. There was just a human being who had done a very dangerous thing with very high skill, and who was now entirely focused on what came next. That, Liara realized, was more frightening and more impressive than any legend she had ever read. She helped Sela up. Pelin, from the doorframe, let out a slow breath. Liara walked forward and stood in front of Cole. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's fine," he said. "I can see that it is not fine." He looked at her for a moment. Then he let her look at the burn. It was bad, deep, and raw, the kind that would hurt considerably more in a few hours when the adrenaline wore off. She did not have the tools to treat it properly. He did. He handed her the correct item from his med kit without her having to ask and talked her through applying it, which she did carefully and without flinching. "Thank you," he said when she was done. It was a simple thing to say, but he said it like he meant it, without performance, and she found she respected that. They moved again. Cole set a slightly slower pace than before, and Liara understood it was because of Pelin, not the shoulder, though the shoulder must have been burning with every step. Danny came through the earpiece again. Cole listened and made a small sound of acknowledgement. He looked at Liara. "There is a safe house possibility about 8 minutes from here," he said. "An underground archive building near the university. The sensors show body heat, multiple people. They are not Crethon." "Survivors," Liara said. "Yes." She looked at the orange sky above the city. Somewhere in that direction, her father's palace was a field of ash. Her world was occupied. She was a princess with no throne, no guard, no army, and no plan beyond the next 8 minutes. She had, however, a human who had just destroyed 14 Crethon warriors by himself and then asked if she was ready to move. She decided that for now, that was enough. "Lead the way," she said. Cole turned and walked, and she followed, and somewhere above them the gray heron waited in the dark. And the Crethon fleet circled a dying world that had not yet finished fighting. The alien princess was confronting death. When a human warrior arrived, Part 4. The archive building was older than the city around it. It had been built 3 centuries ago when the university was still young, and its lower levels had been cut directly into the bedrock beneath the street. The walls were 2 meters thick. The air inside was cool and dry and smelled of old paper and sealed containers. When Cole found the entrance, a side door hidden behind a collapsed market stall, and got it open, 43 Valindrans looked up at him from the dim interior with expressions that ranged from terror to stunned disbelief. Cole looked at them. He noted the number quickly, the way he noted everything, and then he looked back at Liara. She walked past him into the room. The change in her was immediate and visible. She had been running and hiding for over a day. She was tired and dirty, and her clothes were torn. But the moment she stepped into that room and 43 of her people looked at her, something in the way she held herself shifted. Her spine straightened. Her chin came up. She spoke to them in the Valindran language, which Cole did not understand, but the effect was clear. People who had been huddled against walls sat up. An older man near the back closed his eyes and let out a long breath, like a person who had been holding something heavy and had just been told they could set it down. Cole secured the entrance. He checked the other exits, found 2 more, and blocked them from the inside in ways that would slow down entry without making them impossible to open from the inside. He walked the perimeter of the lower level and satisfied himself that the space was as safe as it could be, given everything. Then he sat down against the wall, opened his med kit, and properly treated his shoulder, which had stiffened considerably in the last hour and was communicating its opinions clearly. A small Vailindran child had been watching him from across the room. The child was maybe 5 or 6 years old, silver-skinned like the adults, with enormous dark eyes and hair that floated slightly from static. When Cole finished with his shoulder and clipped the med kit shut, the child walked over, slowly, with the careful courage of someone who is scared, but curious enough to be scared anyway. And the child reached out one small silver-fingered hand and touched Cole's armor. Cole sat still and let him. The child pressed his palm flat against the chest plate and looked up at Cole's face. Cole looked back at him. He did not smile in a forced way or make a large gesture of warmth. He just looked back, steady and calm, and after a moment he gave the child a single small nod. The child seemed to decide something. He sat down beside Cole on the floor. Across the room, a woman who was presumably the child's mother watched this with wide eyes and did not move, because she was not sure what to do about it, and the child seemed fine. Danny came through the earpiece with bad news, which he delivered as gently as someone from Houston who is constitutionally unable to be gentle about bad news could manage. The Crethon had tightened their orbital pattern. Sending the Grey Heron down to ground level for a full extraction was not currently possible. There was a rotation window coming, about 6 hours from now, when a gap would open briefly between the patrol routes, maybe 8 minutes long, enough to come down, load, and get back up if the loading went fast. 8 minutes, 43 people, plus Liara and Sela and Pelin. Cole ran the numbers in his head. He told Danny to keep watching the rotation and to be ready to move on his signal. Danny said he understood and added, "Be careful down there," which was the closest he ever got to expressing concern directly. Cole pulled out a ration bar from his pack, broke it in half, and offered one half to the child beside him. The child took it, sniffed it, and then ate it with the committed focus of someone who had not eaten in a long time. Cole ate the other half. Liara came and sat across from him a while later. Most of the survivors had settled into small groups. Sela was sleeping against a wall, her color much improved. Palin had been taken in by a group of older civilians who had found a blanket for him somewhere. Liara looked at Cole for a moment before speaking. She said, "They want to know who you are." "What did you tell them?" "I told them you are a human soldier who answered our distress signal." She paused. They did not know humans did things like this. Cole said nothing. I did not know either, Liara said. She said it honestly, without embarrassment. Cole looked at his hands for a moment. There is an extraction window in about 6 hours, he said. So a gap in the Crethon patrol rotation. My pilot can bring the ship down, but we will need everyone ready to move fast and load quickly. 8 minutes, maybe less. I will have them ready, Liara said. Cole believed her. He had watched her walk into that room and settle 43 frightened people with her voice and her presence, and he had updated his understanding of her accordingly. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, distantly, there was a low boom from the north quarter of the city. Neither of them reacted to it. They had both gotten used to the sound of things ending. Tell me about your world, Cole said. Before this. Liara looked at him. It was not what she had expected him to say. She talked. She talked about the bioluminescent forests that her father had taken her to see when she was small. How they glowed in blues and greens in the dark, and how you could stand in the middle of one and feel like you were floating inside a star. She talked about the festival of the twin moons, when the whole city would come out at night and they would cook food in the open squares and the musicians would play from the rooftops. She talked about the river market on summer mornings, with the silver fish in the clear water and the smell of something sweet being cooked nearby. She talked about her father's laugh, which was large and genuine and which he never seemed to feel the need to hide. Cole listened to all of it. He did not try to say the right thing or fix anything or tell her it was going to be okay. He sat with his back against the wall and listened, and when she stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. It sounds worth saving, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It is. The room was quiet around them. The child who had touched Cole's armor was asleep on the floor nearby, curled up with his knees drawn in, one hand still resting against the edge of Cole's boot. Liara said, Why did you come? You had no orders. It was not your sector. You had every reason to report the signal and let someone else respond. Cole considered the question the way he considered most things, carefully and without hurry. Someone sent a signal, he said. That means someone was still alive and still hoping. He looked at the sleeping child. That seemed like a good enough reason. Liara was quiet for a while after that. The hours passed. Cole spent part of them moving through the archive's shelves, finding anything useful. Power cells, the old tools, a sealed emergency kit that had a few extra medical supplies. He noted the exits again. He calculated the route from the archive to the nearest open area large enough for the gray heron to touch down. And then he planned the distraction that would make the landing possible. The plan was straightforward in structure and very dangerous in practice. The Crethon patrol density was highest in the northern parts of the city. If something drew them north and kept them busy, the southern approach would be clear enough for Danny to bring the ship down. Cole would create the distraction alone. He would use the salvaged components he had gathered, parts from Crethon weapons he had taken from the fight in the street, combined with components from his own kit to set a series of charges through the North Quarter buildings. Then set them off in sequence, and the Crethon would respond in force. While they were busy with that, Liara would move the survivors south to the landing zone. Danny would bring the ship down. Everyone would load. Cole would get back before the window closed. He explained this to Liara. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, This plan requires you to not be killed. Yes, he agreed. Are you good at that? He thought about it. Good enough so far. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, and he stood up with her, and she did something he did not expect. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his, gently, both hands at her sides. She held it for just a second, and then stepped back. Cole stood very still. He did not know what the gesture meant. Then he did not know that in Valindran culture, it was given only in rare moments. a recognition of courage, a promise to remember. He only knew that it was something important and that it had been offered to him with complete sincerity. He nodded once. "I'll be back before the window closes," he said. He picked up his rifle and his pack of salvaged components, checked his earpiece, and walked to the entrance. Outside, the burning city waited. Inside, a princess began preparing 43 people to run for their lives because a human had told her there was a window, and she believed him. The alien princess was confronting death when a human warrior arrived. Part 5. Cole moved north through the broken city with a pack full of salvaged components and a very clear idea of what he needed to do. The North Quarter was the most damaged part of the capital. Several large structures had already been half-collapsed by the initial Crethon orbital strikes, which meant there were plenty of load-bearing points that could be encouraged to fail in interesting ways. Cole did not need the charges to be powerful. He needed them to be loud, sustained, and spread across enough area that the Crethon response would be wide. A single large explosion would bring a focused unit. A series of smaller ones, spread across 4 or 5 city blocks over several minutes, would bring most of the patrol forces in the area and would require them to fan out and search, which would take time. He set the first charge in the skeleton of what had once been a transit hub. The second went into the foundation wall of a storage building near the northern market. And the third and fourth he placed carefully along the route that Crethon patrols most commonly used, according to what Danny had been observing from the ship's sensors. The fifth he put at the highest accessible point he could find, a broken stairwell 3 floors up overlooking the main northern avenue, because when that one went off, it would be visible from a long way away. Danny talked him through the patrol positions the whole time, voice low and steady in his ear. Cole adjusted twice based on new movement data. He checked each charge connection carefully before moving on. He did not rush. Rushing caused mistakes, and mistakes in this kind of work had permanent consequences. When the last charge was in place, he moved to a position 2 blocks south of the northernmost device and checked his timer. 4 minutes until the extraction window opened. He triggered the first charge. The transit hub groaned and dropped a section of its upper floor with a sound like a crack of thunder. Even from 2 blocks away, Cole felt the pressure of it in his chest. Dust rolled down the street. He was already moving. The second charge went off 40 seconds later, then the third. The Crethon response was fast. He could hear the shift in patrol noise almost immediately, the clicking changing tempo, units changing direction. Danny confirmed it through the earpiece. The northern patrol groups were moving toward the disturbance. Fast. Cole ran south. He was 2 blocks from the archive when the 4th and 5th charges went off almost simultaneously. Now the 5th one on the high stairwell, lighting up the sky above the North Quarter with a column of fire and debris that Danny later said he could see clearly from orbit. Cole did not slow down to look at it. At the archive, Liara had everyone moving before the sound of the first charge finished echoing. She had spent the last hour organizing the survivors into groups of 8, each group with a designated leader who knew the route and the sequence. She had gone over it 3 times with each leader until they could repeat it without hesitation. She had told the parents of young children what to do if their child became scared and how to carry them if they needed to move fast. She had told Pelan, who could still only limp, that 2 of the stronger men would support him and that his only job was to keep moving. She had been, for that hour, as exactly what her father had spent her whole life preparing her to be. When the first charge detonated, she said one word: move. The survivors came out of the archive in organized groups, quick and quiet, moving south through the side streets toward the open plaza that Cole had identified as the landing zone. The Crethon patrol presence in the south was thin now. Danny's sensor updates confirmed it, and the groups moved through the gaps with only one close call, when a small 2-unit Crethon scout came around a corner ahead of the third group. Liara was leading that group personally. She took one look and redirected them through a gap in a collapsed wall without breaking pace. The first groups were already in the plaza when Danny brought the gray heron down. The ship came in fast and low from the southern approach, by dropping through the smoke-layered atmosphere with the landing ramp already opening. It touched the plaza surface with a hard thump, and Danny's voice came through the emergency communicator Cole had given Liara. "You have 7 minutes. Loading now." Liara directed people up the ramp. She counted them as they went. She kept her voice even and clear. She did not look north, even though the sounds from that direction were getting louder. Cole came through the eastern entrance of the plaza at a run with 2 Crethon units on his trail. He had not been able to avoid this. The 5th charge had brought more units south than Danny had predicted, and 2 of them had gotten a visual fix on him during the run back. He had tried to lose them in the side streets and had cut his lead down to about 30 seconds. And he was across the plaza and hitting the ramp before they cleared the eastern entrance. Liara was the last one standing on the ramp. She looked at him, looked at the 2 enormous armored figures coming through the far side of the plaza, looked back at him, and said nothing. She stepped inside. Cole hit the ramp at a run. "Go," he said to Danny. Danny had already started the lift. The ramp closed with a heavy metallic sound. 2 energy blasts hit the underside of the ship and skidded off the hull with a sound like stones thrown at a metal roof. Then the gray heron was up and accelerating, and the ground was falling away below them. Cole leaned against the wall of the cargo hold and let himself breathe. Around him, 43 Valendrans sat in the dim interior of a human scout vessel, pressed together in the space meant for equipment and supplies. Some of them were crying silently. Some were holding each other. The small boy who had sat beside Cole in the archive had found him already and was standing close to his leg, not grabbing on to anything, just near. Cole looked down at him and the boy looked up, and Cole put a hand briefly on top of the boy's head, the way you might reassure a person without words. Danny got them through the orbital gap with 11 seconds to spare. He said this in a tone that suggested it was entirely intentional. They broke through into clean space, and the gray heron's engines shifted from the hard burn of escape to the steady hum of deep travel. The Crethon fleet did not pursue. A single scout vessel was not worth the fuel cost, and they had a planet to finish stripping. Then Liara stood at the forward porthole as the curve of Valindra moved behind them. It was still beautiful from space. The blue atmosphere still glowed. You could not see the burning from here. You could almost believe everything was fine. She did not look away from it for a long time. Cole came and stood near her, not too close. He had gotten the shoulder treated properly now, Danny having applied a stronger seal with considerably more complaint about the original field dressing. He stood quietly and let her look at her world for as long as she needed to. When she turned away from the porthole, her face was very composed and very still. She said, "I will be formally requesting an alliance between Valindra and the Terran Federation. It will go through the proper diplomatic channels with full documentation. My people will need a home while we rebuild, and we will need help taking our world back." "I'll include it in my report," Cole said. She nodded. Then, more quietly, she said something else. She told him that there were memorial scrolls in Valindran culture, kept by the scholars of the old library orders, which had been maintained since the earliest days of their civilization. Names were placed in those scrolls for acts of courage and sacrifice that the culture wanted to remember across centuries. There were scholars who spent their whole lives studying those scrolls. It was the highest recognition her culture could give to a person. She said his name was going in. Cole looked at her. He said he was not sure that was where he belonged. She said, "That is exactly why it is." Danny, from the pilot's seat, It immediately asked if he could have his name in a scroll, too, given that he had, in his words, performed an extremely impressive orbital insertion and extraction under hostile conditions. Cole told him to fly the ship. Danny said he was flying the ship, and he still wanted a scroll. In the cargo hold behind them, 43 survivors of a fallen world began the slow, quiet work of still being alive. The small boy had fallen asleep against a cargo crate, one hand tucked under his cheek. Two older Valindran men were talking in low voices, making plans, already thinking about what came next. Sela was sitting up and eating half a ration bar that someone had found for her. Pelin had his eyes closed, but he was breathing steadily, and the tension had gone out of his face. The gray heron moved through the dark between stars. The Liara stood at the porthole for one more moment before she went to her people. She looked at the stars and thought about the forests of Violindra and the festival of the twin moons and her father's laugh, all of it waiting somewhere inside the occupied world behind her. She thought about a distress signal sent into the void on a dying transmitter and a human soldier who had heard it and turned his ship around, not because he was ordered to, not because there was anything in it for him, but because someone was still alive and still hoping, and that had been reason enough. She thought about what kind of civilization produces people like that. The Crethon had come to Valindra and taken everything. They had done it because they were powerful and because they believed that power was all that mattered. And they had looked at a world without an army and seen something easy. What they had not accounted for, what none of the elder civilizations seemed to fully account for, was this. Somewhere out in the young, loud, unremarkable civilization of humanity, there were people who heard a signal and came, who showed up with a med kit and a rifle and no backup and simply started solving the problem in front of them, who did not weigh the odds or calculate their advantage, who just came. The Crethon had made a mistake. They had given humanity a reason to care about Valindra. Liara Velsorin, last of the Radiant Throne, turned away from the porthole and went to her people. She had work to do.